Section 11 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 2 by Henry Gray. Section 11. Humeral Articulation or Shoulder Joint. Articulatio humeri. The shoulder joint is an enarthrodial or ball and socket joint. The bones entering into its formation are the hemispherical head of the humerus and the shallow glenoid cavity of the scapula, an arrangement which permits a very considerable movement, while the joint itself is protected against displacement by the tendons which surround it. The ligaments do not maintain the joint surfaces in apposition, because when they alone remain, the humerus can be separated to a considerable extent from the glenoid cavity. Their use, therefore, is to limit the amount of movement. The joint is protected above by an arch, formed by the coracoid process, the acromion, and the coracoacromial ligament. The articular cartilage on the head of the humerus is thicker at the center than at the circumference, the reverse being the case with the articular cartilage of the glenoid cavity. The ligaments of the shoulder are the articular capsule, the coracohumeral, the glenohumeral, the transverse humeral, the glenoidal labrum. Footnote: the long tendon of origin of the biceps brachii also acts as one of the ligaments of this joint. See the observations on page 287 on the function of the muscles passing over more than one joint. End of footnote. The articular capsule, capsula articularis, capsular ligament. The articular capsule completely encircles the joint, being attached above to the circumference of the glenoid cavity beyond the glenoid labrum, below to the anatomical neck of the humerus, approaching nearer to the articular cartilage above than in the rest of its extent. It is thicker above and below than elsewhere, and is so remarkably loose and lax that it has no action in keeping the bones in contact, but allows them to be separated from each other more than 2.5 centimeters, an evident provision for that extreme freedom of movement which is peculiar to this articulation. It is strengthened above by the supraspinatus, below by the long head of the triceps brachii, behind by the tendons of the infraspinatus and teres minor, and in front by the tendon of the subscapularis. There are usually 3 openings in the capsule. One anteriorly, below the coracoid process, establishes a communication between the joint and a bursa beneath the tendon of the subscapularis. The second, which is not constant, is at the posterior part, where an opening sometimes exists between the joint and a bursal sac under the tendon of the infraspinatus. The third is between the tubercles of the humerus, for the passage of the long tendon of the biceps brachii. The coracohumeral ligament, ligamentum coracohumerale. This ligament is a broad band which strengthens the upper part of the capsule. It arises from the lateral border of the coracoid process and passes obliquely downward and lateralward to the front of the greater tubercle of the humerus, blending with the tendon of the supraspinatus. This ligament is intimately united to the capsule by its hinder and lower border, but its anterior and upper border presents a free edge, which overlaps the capsule. Glenohumeral ligaments. In addition to the coracohumeral ligament, 3 supplemental bands, which are named the glenohumeral ligaments, strengthen the capsule. These may be best seen by opening the capsule at the back of the joint and removing the head of the humerus. One on the medial side of the joint passes from the medial edge of the glenoid cavity to the lower part of the lesser tubercle of the humerus. A second, at the lower part of the joint, extends from the under edge of the glenoid cavity to the under part of the anatomical neck of the humerus. A third, at the upper part of the joint, is fixed above to the apex of the glenoid cavity, close to the root of the coracoid process, and passing downward along the medial edge of the tendon of the biceps brachii, is attached below to a small depression above the lesser tubercle of the humerus. In addition to these, the capsule is strengthened in front by 2 bands derived from the tendons of the pectoralis major and the teres major, respectively. The transverse humeral ligament is a broad band passing from the lesser to the greater tubercle of the humerus, and always limited to that portion of the bone which lies above the epiphyseal line. It converts the intertubercular groove into a canal and is the homologue of the strong process of bone which connects the summits of the 2 tubercles in the musk ox. The glenoidal labrum, Labrium glenoidale, glenoid ligament, is a fibrocartilaginous rim attached around the margin of the glenoid cavity. It is triangular on section, the base being fixed to the circumference of the cavity, while the free edge is thin and sharp. It is continuous above with the tendon of the long head of the biceps brachii, which gives off two fasciculi to blend with the fibrous tissue of the labrum. It deepens the articular cavity and protects the edges of the bone. Synovial membrane. The synovial membrane is reflected from the margin of the glenoid cavity over the labrum. It is then reflected over the inner surface of the capsule and covers the lower part and sides of the anatomical neck of the humerus as far as the articular cartilage on the head of the bone. The tendon of the long head of the biceps brachii passes through the capsule and is enclosed in a tubular sheath of synovial membrane, which is reflected upon it from the summit of the glenoid cavity and is continued around the tendon into the intertubercular groove, as far as the surgical neck of the humerus. The tendon thus traverses the articulation, but is not contained within the synovial cavity. Bursae. The bursae in the neighborhood of the shoulder joint are the following. 1. A constant bursa is situated between the tendon of the subscapularis muscle and the capsule. It communicates with the synovial cavity through an opening in the front of the capsule. 2. A bursa which occasionally communicates with the joint is sometimes found between the tendon of the infraspinatus and the capsule. 3. A large bursa exists between the undersurface of the deltoideus and the capsule, but does not communicate with the joint. This bursa is prolonged under the acromion and the coracoacromial ligament and intervenes between these structures and the capsule. 4. A large bursa is situated on the summit of the acromion. 5. A bursa is frequently found between the coracoid process and the capsule. 6. A bursa exists beneath the coracobrachialis. 7. One lies between the teres major and the long head of the triceps brachii. 8. One is placed in front of, and another behind, the tendon of the latissimus dorsi. The muscles in relation with the joint are above the supraspinatus, below the long head of the triceps brachii, in front the subscapularis, behind the infraspinatus and teres minor, within the tendon of the long head of the biceps brachii. The deltoideus covers the articulation in front, behind, and laterally. The arteries supplying the joint are articular branches of the anterior and posterior humeral circumflex and transverse scapular. The nerves are derived from the axillary and suprascapular. Movements. The shoulder joint is capable of every variety of movement: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, circumduction, and rotation. The humerus is flexed, drawn forward, by the pectoralis major, anterior fibers of the deltoideus, coracobrachialis, and when the forearm is flexed, by the biceps brachii. Extended, drawn backward, by the latissimus dorsi, teres major, posterior fibers of the deltoideus, and, when the forearm is extended, by the triceps brachii. It is abducted by the deltoideus and supraspinatus. It is adducted by the subscapularis, pectoralis major, latissimus dorsi, and teres major, and by the weight of the limb. It is rotated outward by the infraspinatus and teres minor, and it is rotated inward by the subscapularis, latissimus dorsi, teres major, pectoralis major, and the anterior fibers of the deltoideus. The most striking peculiarities in this joint are: 1. The large size of the head of the humerus in comparison with the depth of the glenoid cavity, even when this latter is supplemented by the glenoid labrum. 2. The looseness of the capsule of the joint. 3. The intimate connection of the capsule with the muscles attached to the head of the humerus. 4. The peculiar relation of the tendon of the long head of the biceps brachii to the joint. It is in consequence of the relative sizes of the two articular surfaces and the looseness of the articular capsule that the joint enjoys such free movement in all directions. When these movements of the arm are arrested in the shoulder joint by the contact of the bony surfaces and by the tension of the fibers of the capsule, together with that of the muscles acting as accessory ligaments, the arm can be carried considerably farther by the movements of the scapula, involving, of course, motion of the acromio and sternoclavicular joints. These joints are therefore to be regarded as accessory